In our previous episode, our boy finally woke up. Meanwhile, the Loop Seal base was under attack by two powerful martial saints from rival organizations. Instead of running, Nepson chose to stay, begging Lu Sheng to save the remaining people and the island. So our boy replied, "As you wish." As we continued where we left off, the two martial saints had already stormed the Grand Hall. By now, the entire island was in ruins, with bodies scattered everywhere. Warner, struggling to hold his ground, barely managed to take a single hit before collapsing. He glared at the two with pure hatred. He never expected that the despicable Dark Demon Society had secretly joined forces with Dark Star. With that, he was killed. As Warner fell lifeless, a fiery glow lit up the distance. The two turned their heads, only to see Harold returning. A towering martial avatar charged toward the island with Harold at the lead. A group of his elite king seals followed closely behind, but as he took in the devastation across the island, rage overtook him. He pointed straight at the two invaders, declaring that they deserved to die. Killing them 1,000 times wouldn't be enough. One of them merely smirked. In response, an equally massive martial avatar materialized behind him. With an arrogant sneer, he mocked Harold, saying anyone could talk big. If Harold thought he had what it took, he should just come and prove it. The very next second, the two colossal avatars clashed. Their fists collided with a force so immense that the resulting shockwave sent tidal waves crashing across the sea, even splitting the ground beneath them. Meanwhile, the other guy figured it was time for him to step in. After all, he didn't want anyone saying he just stood around enjoying the benefits without putting in any effort. Just like that, he summoned his own martial avatar. With a casual flick of his finger, countless glowing energy particles condensed in the air. As his hand came crashing down, the sheer force forced Harold to defend himself with everything he had. Even the King's seals were caught in the blast. But there's nothing they can do. Two martial saints working together to attack their lord made them wonder if was this truly the end for them. Harold knew he was in deep trouble. He could do nothing but shield himself with both arms. Counterattacking wasn't even an option. And as for his subordinates, they could only stand there, completely powerless. The guy with sunglasses had no intention of letting them escape. With a simple motion, he pressed his palm downward. Instantly, an overwhelming force bore down on Harold's men. The weaker ones died on the spot. The few who barely survived almost felt like their bones had been crushed. Their lord was too occupied to help them, and they themselves had no chance of going up against a martial saint. Furious, Harold cursed them, calling the two shameless for launching a sneak attack on their base. Wondering if they feel the slightest bit of disgrace. The man only chuckled, replying that Harold should know how this works. Even if they failed to kill him today, they could still wipe out all their elites on the island. Without them, Harold wouldn't stand a chance in competing for energy crystals. Just as the man glanced at the remaining survivors, something unusual caught his eye. A young man was walking toward him, slowly, almost casually, and, oddly enough, he was even smiling. What the hell did that mean? The young man remained eerily calm, a slight smile playing on his lips as he walked closer. Seeing our boy, the man muttered, saying this was interesting. But in the next moment, his massive martial avatar's hand came crashing down, aiming to flatten whoever it was in one strike. Yet Lu Sheng merely lifted a single finger. That was all it took to stop the devastating attack. With a teasing expression, Lu Sheng looked at his opponent and asked if he still thought this was interesting. The martial saint's eyes widened in pure disbelief. A cold dread swept through his entire body. Before he could even process what was happening, Lu Sheng appeared right in front of him, and with just a light tap of his hand, the man's martial avatar shattered instantly. A terrifying pain shot through the dude's body, as if every bone inside him had just been crushed. His body was sent flying like a cannonball, slamming into the ocean with a deafening crash. Meanwhile, no one could believe what they had just witnessed. Lei, with a trembling voice, demanded to know who our boy really was. Lu Sheng casts him an indifferent glance and tells him he is the deity. The survivors stared in absolute shock. Could Professor Nepson's wild claims actually be true? At that moment, Nepson himself rushed over. He had seen everything, and one strike was all it needed to kill a martial saint. The sheer power of it left him breathless. Nepson fell to his knees. His voice trembled as he proclaimed this was the radiance of the deity himself. Even a peak martial saint could not withstand it. This was exactly like the vision in his dreams. Beside him, Lucia also dropped to her knees. For a brief moment, she couldn't even tell if this was reality or some illusion. Harold, on the other hand, had no idea who Lu Sheng was. Meanwhile, Lei had assumed he was part of Loop Seal. Lu Sheng stood before them and calmly said, "Only one of you gets to live." A chill ran down both their spines. Lei quickly steadied himself and soon began gathering energy in his palm. With a sharp thrust, he hurled it straight at Lu Sheng. But our boy simply flicked his finger and he unleashed Sky-Severing Finger. A powerful wave of energy shot out and in the blink of an eye, it tore straight through Lei's body. Lei stared down at his severed torso in sheer disbelief, and within seconds, he fell onto the ground lifeless. Harold didn't waste a second. The moment Lei fell, he immediately dispelled his martial avatar and dropped to his knees, forehead pressed firmly against the ground. With sweat dripping down his back, he hurriedly blurted out, saying he was the only one left. Lu Sheng glanced at Harold and thought to himself, even a peak martial saint was still human in the end. Fear was natural, not that he had ever planned to kill him anyway. After all, he had milked Loop Seal for an entire year thanks to Nepson, so if he wiped out their leader now, that'd be a little unfair. At that moment, the remaining survivors, all following Harold's example, fell onto their knees, with foreheads pressed against the ground. At that moment, our boy finally understood why everyone in the military had bowed without question when Zhao Ji arrived. Because when someone so powerful appears before them, people are almost forced to kneel. Perhaps, at this moment, he was indeed the deity in everyone's eyes. As the scene shifts inside the conference room, Lu Sheng sits casually, holding his phone as he FaceTime his little sister. Seeing her big brother safe and sound, she was overjoyed and excitedly told him that he'd be in for a surprise when he got back, because she was about to break through to the 4th level. Lu Sheng chuckled, saying that was great progress, then asked her to pass the phone to their parents. The moment his parents saw him, they were overwhelmed with relief, saying it was a blessing he was unharmed and urging him to return home as soon as he could. Lu Sheng reassured them that he would, and also reminded them to take care of their health. Standing nearby, Harold silently watched the whole exchange. His mind was completely blank. He had just witnessed this man instant kill 2 martial saints. And now? Now he was casually chatting with his family like it was just another day. Harold found it impossible to comprehend Lu Sheng still had parents, both still alive and not even 50 years old. He also had a little sister who was not even 18. He couldn't help but wonder just how old was this guy. His mind struggled to accept the reality before him. The person who had just erased 2 international organization leaders from existence in mere moments was perhaps the same age as his great-great-great-grandson. This thought caused him to sweat profusely. If this information got out, the entire world would surely be shaken to its core. The thought of him mocking the news of another martial saint appearing really made him reconsider his life choices. Harold's body tensed when Lu Sheng suddenly looked at his phone screen and told his family he gotta go because someone here was waiting to discuss things with him. Then he tilted the camera slightly, letting his family see Harold. For a split second, Harold froze like a statue. Then, forcing a stiff smile, he awkwardly raised his hand and waved at the screen. With the call ended, Lu Sheng turned to Harold, thanking him for playing along. Harold immediately bowed, saying it was his honor. Lu Sheng figured it was about time to get down to business. He pulled out a glowing energy crystal. The moment Harold saw it, he recognized it immediately. Without waiting for Lu Sheng to speak, he asked how much he wanted. Our boy then asked, "How much can he give?" Harold hesitated for a bit, and after a long internal struggle, he gritted his teeth and said 1 kilogram. This was quite a surprise, since our boy had only asked out of curiosity, but it seemed Harold had assumed he was being shaken down. But 1 kilo was no small amount. For a moment, Lu Sheng rubbed his chin, wondering if he really looked that intimidating. Did he really give off such a bad guy vibe? Then he remarked that Harold must have quite a bit of energy crystals stored up. Harold quickly shook his head, explaining that in over 100 years, he had only managed to save a few hundred grams. But with the death of the 2 major leaders, he planned to absorb their territories. Then he should gather up to 1 kilogram in total. That surprised Lu Sheng. He hadn't expected energy crystals to be that rare. Harold sighed and explained that while they were rare, they weren't this scarce. The real problem was, every time energy crystals were gathered, over 90% had to be handed over to the people he referred to as guides. This is when it got interesting. Could these people be related to that entity Zhao Ji summoned during their fight? Seeing Lu Sheng's confusion, Harold assumed he hadn't encountered the guides yet and quickly explained. Every 10 years, these so-called guides descended upon their planet to calculate the number of 9th-level martial artists and collect energy crystals as tribute. Harold himself only learned about their existence 7 years after he became a martial saint. Lu Sheng cut him off, telling him to skip the useless details and get to the point. Harold quickly continued, explaining that the guides were powerful martial artists from an advanced civilization. Their strength far exceeded anything on Blue Star. Whether they were 10th level or something even beyond that, unfortunately no one knew. But one thing was certain. Since the dawn of martial arts, these guides had been overseeing their planet, shaping the rise of martial arts itself. When the first 9th-level martial saint appeared on Blue Star, the guides established a new order. Every nation's martial artists were required to collect energy crystals and hand them over. The guides never interfered with their battles, but if too many 9th-level martial saints died, they would personally descend and deliver punishment. Lu Sheng asked if 3 martial saints counted as too many. Harold shook his head, saying it wasn't. The last time the guides showed up was during the Great War, because there were 10 martial saint casualties. He then explained that the guides only cared about 3 things. The first was energy crystal production. If production dropped too much, the guides would get angry. In extreme cases, they would force the martial saints to make up the difference. They also require them to defend against the beasts. And if there's a major outbreak, martial saints are also expected to be there and fight off the beasts. And lastly, no 10th level was allowed. Without the guides' explicit permission, no one on Blue Star was allowed to break through past the 9th level. Most martial saints believed this restriction existed because it made resource collection easier for the guides. Since Blue Star was labeled a Tier 1 resource planet, they figured they were nothing more than a farm for them. Lu Sheng carefully compared Harold's words to his own theories. An advanced civilization guides a primitive one to fight off the beasts while simultaneously harvesting resources and suppressing the rise of stronger fighters. But that raised a big question. What happens if someone actually breaks past the 9th level? However, this wasn't a question Harold could answer. Perhaps no one could. He believed that only the guides possessed the path to a breakthrough. Without their knowledge, breaking through was simply impossible. Lu Sheng closed his eyes, deep in thought. After a moment, he asked, "When is the next guide visit?" Harold estimated that it should be in a few months, though he wasn't sure of the exact date. The reception was always handled by a few martial saints from the World Martial Association. However, one thing was certain, which was that the World Grandmaster Tournament would take place right before the guide's arrival, once all the energy crystals had been gathered. Apparently, the World Grandmaster Tournament was nothing but a front for the energy crystal collection. Every martial saint-level force was eligible to participate. This was precisely why Dark Star and Dark Demon Society had teamed up against them. This way, the two could get a bigger share this time. This would also mean a lot of martial saints would be there. Harold nodded, confirming that all the martial saints were expected to attend. Our boy made his decision, saying he would go with Harold. Harold was thrilled, quickly bowing and saying it would be his honor. With someone as powerful as Lu Sheng backing them, they were guaranteed to secure a much larger share of the energy crystals this time. However, Harold was also told he could keep his private stash. Instead, our boy would only take whatever belonged to the 2 destroyed organizations. And there's one more thing, he wanted Harold to take good care of Nepson, saying he still owes Nepson 2 more wishes. Harold quickly said he would do his best. With that settled, Lu Sheng turned to leave, but Harold hesitated because he had one last burning question. So he asked our boy's current level. Lu Sheng glanced over his shoulder with a faint smile and said he was at the 8th level. Harold closed his eyes and said it all made sense. If he had already killed 3 martial saints so effortlessly, then of course he must be 10th level. Then he froze. Wait a second. 8th? 8th?